Welcome. I am a lay Shin Buddhist who nevertheless maintains an interest in the broader realm of Pure Land and Mahayana Buddhist teachings. My YouTube channel is called Akala Akala, that is A-C-A-L-A, A-C-A-L-A. In these podcasts, I make a non-scholarly, humble, and sometimes bumbling attempt to explore a particular topic or question related to the wonderful Buddha Dharma. I hope you find them to be of interest. With that said, let us begin. So today, I'm feeling a little under the weather. It's nothing serious, but it brings to mind how we can sort of have some cognitive distortions at a point in time when we're not feeling 100%, and perhaps have a more gloomy or pessimistic view on life. And this kind of nullifies or contradicts the overall feeling of joy that we may have in knowing that we are grasped but never to be abandoned by Amida Buddha. Reverend Kenryu Tsuji addresses this kind of contradiction in his Profession of Faith, which I've covered sections of in previous podcasts. Specifically, he addresses what seems to be a contradiction between Article 5 and Article 8 of this Profession of Faith. Just to cover those, in Article 5, it says, "We rejoice that this grace is accorded freely and equally to us as well as all other living beings, and this joy pervades our every thought and act." So, again, this sense that part of our subjective experience in trusting in the power of the primal vow is a sense of joy that, as Reverend Tsuji says, pervades our every thought and act. He makes a brief comment about rejoicing where he says, "Our hearts are filled with rejoicing, for that which seemed impossible, the attainment of Buddhahood, has been made possible by the universal gift of Amida Buddha. Nothing surpasses this joy." So, again, we thought it was impossible because we're aware of our own limitations. We're aware that perhaps we've made attempts to perfect our character, attempts to follow the Bodhisattva path, attempts to attain Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. But those attempts have failed, and in the context of that experience, we have thankfully been gifted by Amida Buddha with Shinjin, or a sense of entrusting, which is associated with a feeling of joy. Now, from there we go to Article 8 of the Profession of Faith, where Tsuji says, "We search within ourselves by the light of Amida's compassion, and find that we have drowned in the ocean of selfish desires, that we have lost our way in the pursuit of power and gain. Though we have entered the company of the faithful, we are pained that true joy does not brighten our hearts." So again, tying back into an experience we might have when we're feeling under the weather or sick in some way, particularly if it's a more serious illness, we can be drowned in the ocean of selfish desires, the desire to be healthy, the desire to not have to face the potential that each of us has and ultimately will have of bodily dysfunction in the context of what Sakyamuni Buddha taught as, old age, illness, and death even. And so, as he says, we have lost our way in the pursuit of power and gain. In this case, the power in some sense of controlling our own body, controlling our own physiological destiny, which is impossible to do because we're each a human being. We're each a limited human being, limited not only in terms of the potential we have to attain enlightenment, but limited in the degree to which we can influence what happens to our own physical entity, our own physical body and well-being, which obviously, again, at some point in time is going to experience sickness, and at some point in time ultimately will face its own demise. So he gives a little description here of what he characterizes as contrition that sort of addresses this contradiction. So see if this makes sense when he says, "When we compare Article 5 and Article 8, we discover an inconsistency. On the one hand, we are joyful of Amida's grace, and on the other, we are pained true joy does not brighten our hearts. So just to state, we not only are we not joyful, in other words, we're kind of downhearted as a result of whatever illness it is that we're facing, but we're also kind of kicking ourselves for the fact that we're not experiencing the joy that we, quote, should be experiencing as a result of being embraced by Amida. So anyway, he goes on to say, here is the glaring paradox we discover in our inner lives when we see it under the light of Amida's compassion. It is only reasonable that if we are grateful for Amida's compassion, then our joy should be constant. On the contrary, we are so attached to worldly things we cannot honestly declare, above all things I cherish Amida. Shinran Shonin, too, was conscious of this conflict. In his spiritual anguish, he cried, quote, why can I not be so full of joy over Amida's compassion that I am inspired to dance on earth? Close quote. He deeply repented his fierce passion for worldly things, which more often than not blinded his spiritual insight. But it was for such beings that Amida made his primal vow. Therefore, the more he repented his selfish desires, the more grateful he became, and by that same token, the more he felt gratitude, the more repentant he became. So, if not a full-fledged, comprehensive explanation of the dynamics of this experience, we're given here the solution, if you will, which is, again, to remind ourselves that we don't experience constant joy because it's in our nature not to be able to attain such an idealistic state from a subjective point of view, but that we should not kick ourselves because that's precisely why Amida made the vow. He made the vow to save us suffering beings, to save us even in spite of our limitations with respect to our difficulty sometimes in accepting the fact that, in this case, that we cannot control all of the elements that produce sickness of the body. Now, to take this to a more extreme position with respect to the issue of death, given the fact that we who are Shin Buddhists believe firmly that when we die we'll be reborn in the Pure Land of Happiness, it's not like we want that to occur any sooner than it has to. And in some sense you say, well, why is that? And this issue is addressed in Chapter 9 of the Tani Show, which I've been quoting some from. And again, just simply represents a more extreme form beyond sickness to that other level that Sakyamuni talked about, which is, old age and death. So in the Tani Show, Yenbo, who wrote the book, he says he asked something of Shinran. So he says, I asked the master, although utterance of the name emerges from within me, I scarcely experience such joy that I leap and dance, and I have no aspiration to go to the Pure Land quickly. Why is this? And then Shinran replies, this is a question that troubled me in the past, and now, Yenbo, it occurs to you also. When I reflect deeply on my failure to rejoice that my birth in the Pure Land is settled, something for which a person should dance with joy in the air and on the earth, I realize all the more clearly, through this very absence of joy, that my birth is indeed settled. So again, he's saying, because I don't experience the joy, it's just simply evidence of my limitations. And that, again, ties back to the reason that Amida made his vow for us. So Shinran goes on to explain, he says, what suppresses the heart that ought to take joy and prevents me from rejoicing is the activity of my blind passions. But the Buddha, knowing this beforehand, said that he would save the foolish being full of blind passions. Such, then, is the compassionate vow of other power. Realizing that it is precisely for the sake of such people as myself, I feel it all the more trustworthy. I want to just make the point here that Shinran, when he speaks, he doesn't generalize to all beings typically. He very much directs the impact of the primal vow onto himself. He recognizes himself personally as a foolish being full of blind passions. So again, this is not preachy in terms of what y'all should believe. This is him relating to this system of entrusting directly to himself as a person. He goes on to say, in the context of not wanting to go quickly to the Pure Land, he says, "Not wanting to go quickly to the Pure Land, or becoming forlorn with thoughts of death, even when slightly ill, is also the activity of our blind passions. It is hard for us to abandon this old home of suffering where we have been wandering from distant past kalpas down to the present, and we feel no longing for the Pure Land of peace, where we have never been born. This is indeed because our blind passions are so intense. But even though we feel regret at parting from this world, when our karmic bonds to it run out, and for all our powers our life ends, we shall go to that land. Amida pities especially the person who lacks the aspiration to go to the Pure Land quickly. Hence, I feel all the more that the great vow of great compassion is to be entrusted to, and that my birth is settled." And he ends this chapter in his message to Yenbo in the context of Yenbo's question to him. He says, "If you felt like dancing with joy and wished to go to the Pure Land quickly, you might begin to doubt whether you really had blind passions." That's one we need to reflect on, that really sort of expresses the irony of the fact that it's totally understandable that we don't dance with joy in the context of feeling ill or anticipating our demise. Of course, it's totally natural also from the standpoint of the survival instinct that we have sort of genetically built into us as a Homo sapiens species. But here, Shinran ties it back into the spiritual realm and helps give us an explanation as to how to address this seeming contradiction that Reverend Suji identified. And finally, before completing this particular podcast episode, it occurs to me that I hadn't given a reference to the version of the Tani Show that I had been quoting from in the context of my commentary. The book, which is a wonderful one and happens to be the one that I latched onto early in my conversion to Buddhism, although there are many other translations and some certainly very wonderful ones. This one in particular is called Tani Show, a Primer. Tani Show, then there's a colon, and it says a primer. Tani Show, a primer, and then the subtitle is A Record of the Words of Shinran Set Down in Lamentation Over Departures from His Teaching. So this was supposedly written in the context of some people shortly after Shinran's parinirvana, so to speak, that Yenbo was concerned that some people were deviating from Shinran's true teaching. So this was why he wanted to set down what he says that he heard Shinran say in order to clarify the true doctrine with respect to Shinran's perspective on spirituality. In any case, this particular volume was translated by Dennis Hirota, and it was first published by Ryokoku University in 1982 and was distributed by Ryokoku University Translation Center in Kyoto, Japan. I am so grateful that they did that, and so grateful that I encountered it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, as are, I'm sure, all the other translations of this volume by Yenbo. Namo Amida Butsu. With that, I will sign off by reciting the Nembutsu in gratitude for being embraced and accepted just as I am by Amida Buddha. Never, never to be abandoned. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.